Whakatakata hau ki te uru, whakatakata hau ki te tonga, kia mākina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi ake ana e te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihei Māori ora. Tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai haere mai ki te Māori and Antarctica ka mua ka muri seminar series. The intent of the series is captured in that concept of ka mua ka muri, and that's walking backwards into the future. And that's the space that we want to create here, a space where Hapu and Iwi can get informed about and reflect on our history of connection to Antarctica and the Southern Ocean. And then based on that history of connection, think about what we want it to look like in the future. And having our eyes on those aspirations in the future, what do we need to be doing now? So how do Hapu and Iwi want to have voice and representation in Antarctic science, policy and governance? So it's a big kaupapa, and there's lots of smaller kaupapa within that, but hopefully this process creates a platform for Hapu and Iwi to engage on it on their own terms. Ko Billy Venue Tret Tōku Ingoa, no ahi te reiri ahau, no ngā rauru, tū hoi, me Ngāti Nīralanda ahau. Right, so I'm Dutch on my dad's side. I'm facilitating the seminar series and the wānanga, but I'm just one part of a much bigger team. And that team's the Vision Mātauranga branch of the Ross Sea Research and Monitoring Program. It's funded by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. And this seminar series itself is funded by Te Pūnaha Matatini. We're a diverse team from iwi, Crown Research Institutes and universities, and even have Kayukon Athabaskan joining us from Alaska. She's online and we'll get to meet her tomorrow. She's based at Stanford University in the US. So reflecting on the complexity of this kaupapa, we have a really diverse team and we each bring our own perspectives and approaches to tackling this issue. And as you follow through the seminar series, you'll get to know each of us quite intimately, but if you want to engage with who's involved, please jump on the website, MāoriAntarctica.org, and you can find out all that information there. So we've already had 4 seminars, it's 5 now, 4 yesterday, that introduced the kaupapa, spoke of Māori voyaging to the Southern Ocean, how Te Ao Māori can help us reimagine Antarctic science, and how ice melt may affect coastal communities. And you can engage with those on the website now. They're taking a little time to end up on there, but a few of them are available. So please jump on and share them widely. That'd be great. Today we've had 2 seminars. So before we had Jack Fennedy talking about fishing in the Southern Ocean. And now we're following up with Matt Pinkerton, a nice kind of follow-up, talking about the Ross Sea and management of the marine protected area established in the Ross Sea. And more specifically about the research and monitoring program, of which he's the principal scientist based in NIWA. So Matt, I just want to thank you for joining us today. We know that you're ridiculously busy, so thanks for squeezing us in. But more broadly, thank you for supporting our approach to the Vision Mātauranga branch of this research project. Your support and tautoko has been fundamental to designing and getting this approach up and running. So before I pass over to you, Matt, I just wanted to remind everybody it's a two-way conversation. The chat channel is open for anybody's questions, so please fire them away as soon as you think them, because we can come back to them at the end. We'll facilitate a question and answer session then. So Matt, just to say tēnā koe and let you take control, and we'll come back at the end for questions and answers. Kia ora.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks Billy for setting up this series. A little bit of background to me. I'm at NIWA in Wellington. I'm a marine scientist, so I got first involved with Antarctic and the Ross Sea back in about 2004, and I've been involved ever since through trying to put an ecosystem component into some of the fisheries research that New Zealand was doing at the time. So I'll just start my presentation. See how that goes. Okay.
Yeah, we can see that, Matt. That's awesome.
Hopefully everyone can see that. So this is what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about following on from what Jack spoke about this morning, especially around the fishery. So this talk is going to be about the fishery and also about the background to that, and also the links to the rest of the ecosystem. So a quick history of Southern Ocean exploitation. So really it started around 1790 with seal harvesting in the Southern Ocean, and very quickly those populations of fur seals especially were hunted close to extinction, and sealers began turning to elephant seals and some species of penguin for their oil. They too were very quickly over harvested. Whaling started around 1904 with all the 7 species of major whale found in the Southern Ocean, very extensively exploited. So more than 500,000 whales were killed during those early years of the whaling. In 1987, a moratorium on commercial whaling was introduced. Whale sanctuaries were established in the Southern Ocean, as late as 1994. And people that have been following this will know that Japanese and Norwegian scientific whaling has continued since. Really, I think this coming year will be the first year that Japan is not intending to catch whales in the Southern Ocean. So they've discontinued their whaling program. There was also going on alongside a lot of the exploitation of the marine resources. There was a kind of land grab going on around the early 20th century, with different countries staking claim to different parts of the Antarctic continent with a view to future mineral exploitation. And so to try and head off that turning into a full-scale conflict, in 1959 the Antarctic Treaty was signed, which basically set aside the Antarctic continent for science, stopped any development of mineral rights in the area, and that kind of took away that kind of bite from countries trying to claim territorial ownership of different parts of the Antarctic continent. Some of those claims kind of still hang over today, different countries claiming different parts of the Antarctic continent, but there's still this agreement that the continent as a whole will be managed for science and for peaceful purposes and without any exploitation. The issue with that Antarctic Treaty is that it completely ignored all the living resources in the ocean around the Antarctic continent. And so large-scale fin fishing began in the Southern Ocean. There's overexploitation of some species of rock cobs over there. And there was also increasing use of krill, removal of krill in the Southern Ocean. And so in 1982, some 20 years after that, the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, so that's CAMLR, was established to manage fisheries and exploitation of living resources in the Southern Ocean. And that was quite a breakthrough in a number of ways. Firstly, the agreement was that between the 26 countries that signed up for that original CAMLR document was that fishing would be allowed in the Southern Ocean, but it must be conducted in a way that was quite conservative, which didn't damage the ecosystem, and which was very highly regulated. So the countries that were very pro-fishing were happy to sign up to it because fishing was still allowed, and the countries that were more towards protection were happy because the protection protocols of that one were very strong, and that's continued to date. This is kind of what CAMLR looks like. So it basically looks like lots of people from all the countries that signed up to CAMLR meeting up for 2 or more weeks at a time, usually in Hobart in Australia, where the headquarters is based, and trying to bash out ways of managing the fishery, so catch limits and other conservation measures. And the whole concept of CAMLR is that it's based around consensus. So all countries have to agree on all decisions. And if one country dissents, then the decision can't be made, which is both a strength and a weakness. So particularly, New Zealand's got an interest in the Ross Sea region. This is the Ross Sea region. So in the top right-hand corner there, you'll see the red area, which is the area that CAMLR has jurisdiction over in the Southern Ocean. It's approximately south of 60 degrees south. And south of New Zealand, the main area is the Ross Sea region. And it's a particularly valuable region because of all the parts around the Antarctic continent, it's got the highest primary productivity. So it's the richest ecosystem around the whole Southern Ocean. It's also one of the least modified shelf ecosystems in the world in a recent study, which means that it's got its full complement of top predators. Some of them are reduced, some of them are recovering from those exploitation, especially the great whales that we talked about. But it's got, full complement of the crab-eater seals, the whale seals, leopard seals, Ross seals. It's got a full complement of the toothed whales and the baleen whales. It's also one of the richest seabird ecosystems in the world. So in the Ross Sea alone, there's more than 1/3 of the world's populations of Adelie penguins and a similar proportion of the emperor penguins. So that high productivity in the area, by virtue of the oceanography of the Southern Ocean, leads to this incredibly high diversity and high richness ecosystem in the Southern Ocean. My kind of scientific interest is looking at food web structure and function. So naturally, given this problem, I kind of looked at it in terms of the food web approach. So this kind of ties into a lot of what we've heard earlier on, this spider web of ecosystem, where the different parts of the system are interconnected in a very intricate and carefully balanced way, so that they complement each other and they link together to create something that's greater than the sum of the parts. So this is a very sort of simplified schematic of what the food web of the Ross Sea region looks like. And I'll just take you through some parts of that now. So they're the predators that I was talking about: the flying birds, the penguins, the seals, the baleen whales, and the toothed whales. These are the air-breathing predators in the Ross Sea that are probably the most visible part of the system. But you know, it's important to note that all the energy into the system comes from the plankton, the microscopic algae that float around in the ocean or are attached or in the sea ice. And they really what lead to that generation of organic matter that then fuels the rest of the food web. The Ross Sea is kind of unusual because it's got this narrow waist. So from the primary productivity, rather than going into a massive range of smaller species, there's quite a small number of species in the Ross Sea, a small number of zooplankton, and then there's krill that you'll have heard of, Antarctic silverfish, and other small bait fish. There's some squids, and then there's a relatively small number, much fewer number of species in the Ross Sea than in the New Zealand region, for instance, of demersal fish. So these are fish living close to the seabed. Now, toothfish sits at a really crucial part of that food web. It's singly the biggest, largest marine fish predator in the Ross Sea. So there's not a kind of range of sharks and other large fish in the area. It's basically a toothfish sitting at the top of that fish food web. And it's eating some of those demersal fish and some of the squid and the silverfish. And in turn, it's been eaten by some seals, some species of toothed whale, and also now being taken by fishing. So this is Jack did a great job this morning of talking about the realities of fishing. This is kind of the reality of fishing down in the Ross Sea. It's a big species. It can grow to more than 1 meter long, weigh quite a lot, and it's taken by longline fishing in the Southern Ocean. This is you know, compared to the size of a person, these fish are pretty big. So it's pretty easy to see that this is the big top predator in the marine system. This is a video taken from a baited video line, just seeing how these fish move in the sort of natural environment. So you can see the toothfish coming in. It kind of bumps itself against the bait, which is a piece of squid, and then it kind of wipes its lateral line along the side of the thing, the bait, to taste it, to work out what it is. Unfortunately for this fish, as it's trying to work out whether this would be a good feed, another fish comes in, so it's not going to bother with that and just goes for it. So these are big fish, big powerful fish. They take just about anything they can get their mouths on, which is mostly these some squid and some of the large fish that live near the seabed. Now, by the time you get up to this kind of part of the food web, there's not a huge amount of food around. So these fish are quite opportunistic. They're only eating maybe their body weight every year, so they don't need a huge amount of food. But anything they get the chance to eat, they do. This is kind of what the long line fishing looks like. So the lines are long lines, a number of kilometers long, are set out from the back of the vessel. They've got hooks, baited hooks on those. The lines sink to the seabed, and then they're left there for maybe 24 hours. And then the ships go back and pick them up with toothfish catch on that. And you can see on this one as well, the red lines there, as this is being deployed, these are to keep diving birds like albatross away from the hooks. So I said that the Camelar had a balance between fishing and conservation, and that's embodied in the 3 principles of conservation. And they are, first of all, to ensure stable recruitment of the target population. So you're not going to overfish the fish that you're looking for. you've got to make sure that you don't take too many fish out, that the fish can't reproduce and keep replacing the fish which are being caught. Secondly, you've got to maintain ecological relationships. So this was very revolutionary at the time that CAMLR came in. The acknowledgement that if you affect a target species, you're also going to affect the things that it eats and the things that eat it in the system. And so CAMLR specifically says you've got to maintain and protect those ecological relationships. The third part is that you've got to make sure that any changes you make to fishing are reversible or potentially reversible over 20 or 30 years. Now, these are very difficult things to achieve even now scientifically. And so CAMLR had to make a decision about how it would implement these principles without really having the science to know how to do it. So they put in place some rules which were kind of like lines in the sand. So said, okay, we'll only exploit these things to 50% of their unfished level. So that's a much more conservative line than if toothfish were in the New Zealand region. So if toothfish were in the New Zealand region, it's likely they'd be exploited at about 30 or 40% of their unfished level. In the Southern Ocean, it's 50% to give you that buffer. There are some species in the Southern Ocean that are exploited only down to 75% of their unfished level, which is again much more conservative level. So this is how toothfish are assessed for the size of the stocks. What happens is a proportion of the fish are taken out and they're given tags and then they're put back into the water. And we know that they survive this kind of experience. They don't have fish bladders, swim bladders, so they can survive being pulled out of the water for a short time and being put back. And then a little bit, when the fish are re-caught in the future, the rate at which tagged fish are caught relative to untagged fish gives you an indication about the size of the population. So this allows us to estimate how big the stock is and set a catch limit, which is going to, in the long term, bring us down to that 50% exploitation level. Now, there is a lot of argument to be had scientifically, I guess, and in terms of conservation about whether 50% is an appropriate level or whether it should be higher than that if you are more pro-conservation or lower than that if you are more pro-fishing. Because of this balance between the different countries in CAMLR, that 50% has basically been maintained right from the establishment of CAMLR. But I think there's definitely issues about whether that is the appropriate level. Okay, so I'm going to just have a quick talk about the ecological effects of fishing. So first of all, the two main effects we're going to look at is the effect of fishing on toothfish prey and the effects of fishing on toothfish predators. So in terms of the prey species of toothfish are also the species that are caught in the bycatch. So apart from skates, which toothfish don't eat, the macruris, the rattails, the icefish, the eel cods and the deep sea cods down on the right side are all prey items for toothfish. It's not surprising really, these are the only medium-sized fish species in the area, so these are the prey items of toothfish, and they also, the larger ones of these are big enough to be able to take the hooks from the longline vessels. So what happens is the potential for a trophic cascade where you reduce the abundance of toothfish and then you increase the abundance of some of these other species. At the same time, you're taking some of these other species out as bycatch. And it looks like the predation release is going to be a stronger effect than the amount you're taking out by bycatch. And the risk of this is that if there's a dominant species, so if one of these rat-tailed species is dominant of the other, this kind of predation release can unbalance that community and lead to problems with sustainability amongst these species. So that's something we're still working on in terms of modelling and monitoring. I'm not going to say much more about that. I'm going to talk about the toothfish predators. So there's three main predators of toothfish in the Ross Sea region. One of them is Weddell seals. So researchers have known for a long time that if you break a hole in the ice down by McMurdo Sound, the first thing that happens is a Weddell seal pops up with a toothfish in its mouth. And often these Weddell seals seem to be offering these toothfish to the people that are up there, maybe like a puppy does, or maybe they're just showing off having these toothfish. But they certainly like sticking their heads out of these holes with the toothfish in their mouth. And researchers have also found, diving under the ice, remains of these toothfish crammed into cracks underneath the ice where maybe the seals have left them for a later meal. But although we know that Weddell seals eat toothfish, we don't know how much they're eaten, how much toothfish are eaten, whether it's critical for the Weddell seals, and whether reducing the abundance of toothfish in the area are going to adversely affect these Weddell seals. So we've there's a lot of things that are not known about Weddell seals. We know a lot about when they arrive, when the pups are born, and we know through satellite tagging where the adults go in winter as they disperse, as the sea ice builds up. Unlike a lot of seals, Weddell seals can actually stay in the area even with sea ice on, because they can gnaw through the ice using their teeth and create their own ice holes. But they also have a particular physiology where the female Weddell seal loses maybe 40% of her body weight during lactation while she's feeding her pup. And so that puts her at a very vulnerable part if food availability is reduced at that time. So we're trying to understand better those potentials for the fishery to affect the ecological viability of these Weddell seals. The other predator of toothfish in the Ross Sea are killer whales. So this is a video which is taken from South Georgia, so on the other side of the Antarctic continent, showing toothfish on a long line. And in that part of the world, the killer whales have learned to strip the long lines of toothfish. You see there's a fish there that one of the killer whales had a smell of and left. That was a rat tail on the line. So they're only picking, they particularly like eating the toothfish. Now they can strip the whole fishing line. Now this has never been observed in the Ross Sea to date. So there's no predation of toothfish from fishing lines from killer whales. But there is, if that did happen, then it would lead to a lot of problems. It would firstly go against the Camelot principles of conservation because it's changing the ecosystem, and so it would mean that some measures had to be put in place in order to try and stop this happening. It's made more complicated by the fact that there's lots of different types of killer whale. There are the type A killer whales, which tend to eat whales, other whales, minke whales in particular. There's the type B, which tend to eat seals and penguins. You see a lot of pictures of those, videos of those, where they upset an ice floe with a seal on it in formation and then eat the seal. And then there's the type C, which is also known as the Ross Sea killer whale, which is the smallest ecotype, which is very specifically a fish eater. And so we're trying to work out, and colleagues are trying to work out how much of the diet of these type C killer whales is made up of toothfish as opposed to other fish in the area. Interestingly as well, tracking from the University of Canterbury showed that some of these killer whales travel between the Ross Sea and New Zealand. So some of the killer whales that we see around New Zealand actually have this migration pattern between the Ross Sea and here. So we're actually very connected in terms of these movements of these mammals with the Ross Sea. So at present, we can't determine the risk of the fishery to the fishery for toothfish predators. We're still working on that, and so at the moment, until we get better evidence on that, the catch limits for toothfish just stay as they are. But recognizing this kind of issue about potential overlap between the toothfish predators and toothfish, this was one of the arguments which led to the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area coming into effect. So the idea of this one is that one of the ideas of this is that we want to separate where the killer whales are and where the fishery is operating. The Ross Sea Marine Protected Area is the world's largest marine protected area. It came into effect only a couple of years ago in 2017, and the proposal was followed more than 10 years of work by New Zealand and the USA to try and bring in this kind of large area protection into the Southern Ocean, into the Ross Sea. It had to be supported by all Camelot members. So you can imagine the political negotiations that went on to get Russia and the Ukraine and other very pro-fishing nations to agree to setting up a large area of no catch in the Ross Sea. One of the interesting things to notice about the Ross Sea MPA is that it doesn't change the catch limit, it just changes the location at which the catches are taken. So in terms of those ecosystem effects that span across the boundaries of the MPA, they tend to be unchanged. And that's part of the research that we're doing to try and understand what amount of protection an MPA gives, even when you have mobile species moving through the area. It has three main objectives: to conserve ecological structure and function. That's we protect different bits of the system because they're different in different areas. To mitigate the threats to the ecosystems from fishing, and to provide a reference area to try and look at the effects of climate change and fishing. And one of the unusual things about the Ross Sea MPA is that it's only designated for 35 years. So at 35 years, that protection will end unless all 26 Camelot members agree that it needs to continue. So that obviously needs a lot of scientific evidence in order to demonstrate that it's effective and that it needs to continue. And that's where the Ross Ramp project came in. So we said, well, we'll make a start on trying to generate methods to produce this information and ways of analysing it to try and look at how effective the MPA is being. We also had a very strong Vision Mataranga component to this, which was to look at exploring the Maori connections and aspirations and opportunities in the Ross Sea region. You know, it strikes me to some extent that rather than taking fish out or harvesting resources from the Ross Sea, tourism might be a better opportunity. And so there are opportunities other than just fishing for the Ross Sea region. Second part of that is Kamala's approach to management consistent with Kaitiakitanga? And that's something that Billy and Scylla in particular have been looking very closely at. And the third part is to build a community and to open pathways of communication between Māori and Antarctic governance in New Zealand, so that when New Zealand goes and plays its role internationally in this management, there's a Maori voice alongside the government voice. So in terms of getting involved with this kind of work in the Antarctic, I'm just putting up 3 ideas here. First one is to get involved on the governance side, being part of these delegations and actually connecting with other countries and trying to work through the tricky political, scientific negotiating points which lead to actual change in management of the Southern Ocean resources. Second one is you can go down on Antarctica and New Zealand field events. So they generally fly down. These are events that we've been running, looking at the whale seals, putting transmitters on the heads of whale seals and cameras to try and look at where they're going and what they're eating, and find out really how they're interacting with the environment and what they're foraging on. And there's also, we've been involved with Tangaroa voyages, the research vessel, New Zealand's research vessel Tangaroa, which goes down every other year. It's going down in the start of 2021. It takes about 21 scientists, and they look at various aspects around the Ross Sea, including the primary productivity, the midwater organisms, and the fisheries down there. Okay, that's the end of my talk. I'll have to acknowledge funding from the MB colleagues and co-authors, and this is a picture of Tangaroa on the voyage down in 2018, which was very high ice year, where the ice built up on the superstructure of the ship because they were there very close on to the end of the season as the sea ice was all building up. Okay, thanks very much.
Kia ora, Matt. Thank you very much for that. Awesome presentation. I think you've touched on some really important points that we've picked up from previous presentations or seminars already really nicely. I'll just go over to the chat channel because there's a few questions coming up. Okay, so was the notion of rational use first introduced at the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting in 1975 or later by CAMLA? Governance-y question?
Well, I can't really answer that. I don't know that. I think my understanding is that rational use is a CAMLA term, and the idea of rational use is that it allows for harvesting, but in a way which also recognizes the larger implications of fishing and exploitation in an ecosystem. So it looks at, so it involves the concept not only of maintaining that target stock, but of protecting the relationships of that stock to all the associated dependent species, and also includes the concept of reversibility. So if you stop fishing, the system is supposed to go back to as it was before fishing. You know, this is the issue of there, as well as if your climate change is happening in parallel, then maybe the system that it goes back to if you stop fishing is not the same as the one that you did before fishing ever started. So that moving baseline due to climate change is a complication which fisheries managers have got to deal with.
Cool, thank you. And a follow-up question along those sorts of lines. How does Ross Ramp support the work of SC CAMLA? Is it independent to the work of SC CAMLA, or does it fit into it, the research and monitoring efforts? Who communicates the science to the Commission? And I guess the follow-up question is, what inspired you to begin this project? Did you see a policy need yourself, or were you directed or advised by MFAT? Is it a government-led sort of initiative?
Okay, so CAMLA is a complicated organisation. So one of the very strong things about CAMLA is that the science is debated among scientists, and then the results of the science are presented and summarised by the scientific committee to the Commission. So the Commission involves the politicians, I guess you might say, who make the decisions at the end of the day. The scientific committee is made up of scientists. And so the advice that the Commission gets from scientific committee is scientific advice, which should be unaffected by politics. And if they then want to disregard that scientific advice and make a decision based on the politics, they have to be very clear that that's what they're doing and it's not been justified by the science.
Mm-hmm.
So the work that we do in RAMP and in other projects around New Zealand goes through peer review at the Antarctic Working Group, which is the technical working group that looks at research. And then if that gets accepted as the paper, that paper gets submitted as part of the New Zealand delegation papers to the appropriate CAMLR working group. Then during those meetings, it's discussed by the international members, and hopefully the recommendations that we've made will then be written into the recommendations to a scientific committee and carried on up to commission level. So all New Zealand submissions have to go through that process. They basically have to be assessed through the working groups. Second part of the question, just remind me of the second part of the question, Billy.
Sorry, I've got to scroll back up to it. What inspired you to begin the project? So is this a policy directive from MFAT, this whole project, or is it something done at the lower level in terms of personal interest by scientists?
So I've been working on these ecosystem effects of fishing, as I say, back to 2004. So it's got a lot of very personal connection to me. And so I was kind of part of the team that put together the case for the MPA, and I've seen that, go well and go badly, and then finally get accepted through CAMLR. So one of the reasons that was accepted by CAMLR is because it was couched very much from a scientific point of view. So we're putting in this MPA because we're going to use this to improve our knowledge about the system and what's going on down there, and better manage it, and to better understand how to manage fisheries in other parts of the Southern Ocean as well. Mm-hmm. So once you've made that case, the country is kind of committed to actually following through on that and actually doing the research. If you made that argument and then you said, oh, we're not going to fund any research down there, it would look pretty bad internationally. So we put a case together saying, we've made this commitment and this is the research that we think should happen. And then we put that up as through the competitive research proposals through the Endeavour Fund. And we were successful in that. So we get the money to do the 5 years of research. In 2 years' time, when that funding ends, there will not be any more research from RAMP, but other avenues of funding will continue and will keep feeding into this research that New Zealand does around the Ross Sea, such as the Antarctic Science Platform and direct funding through the Ministry for Primary Industries.
Cool. I'm just noticing there's a few people answering other people's questions, so just engage with the Q&A and the chat channel if you've got a few questions up there. I'm probably not going to get through to all of them, sorry. I do have one here from Dan Hikuroa, who spoke with us yesterday. Kia ora, Dan. A really informative kōrero, he says. A couple of comments regarding whether the monitoring program is consistent with kaitiakitanga. It would be if you were focusing on Māori impacts and or focusing on managing humans with impacts manifest in the ecosystem and not managing the ecosystem itself. And I think that's, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, well, I've heard similar comments before, around New Zealand, and I think that we actually manage ecosystems is a complete dead end, because there's no way that we manage ecosystems. And the analogy that I kind of like is, which might or might not work in this forum, is about your pancreas. So you think about your pancreas and you say, do you manage your pancreas? And you go, no, I've really no idea what it does. It just sits around somewhere in me and does something good. But you do know how to look after your health, right? You kind of do exercise, you eat properly, you do all the things that are good for your health, and that's good for your pancreas. And so we don't manage an ecosystem. We don't have anywhere near the kind of knowledge to manage the ecosystem. What we've got to do is manage our human impacts on the ecosystem in order to try and allow it to manage itself in a healthy way. And that's kind of what we're doing in the Ross Sea. We're not managing the Ross Sea ecosystem. We're completely ignorant about that and unable to manage it in any way. What we're trying to do is stop our activities messing up parts of it that then have bigger effects on other parts of it. So I think that distinction between managing the ecosystem and managing the human impacts, we are actually just trying to manage the human impacts.
Yeah, cool.
In terms of Māori, I think that's really interesting. You know, looking at taking a food web view, I think leads us very nicely down the line of the synergies between Western science, I guess, looking at food web interconnections and Māori. You know, the whole is an interconnected organism to some extent, and you can't expect to have health in all of it if you damage parts of it too strongly. So taking that interconnected view is really crucial, but both across the living organisms and the physical environment and the organisms that live within it.
Can I just jump in here briefly too, actually, Matt? One of the other really interesting things about the MPA is that it only goes for 35 years. And so Nigel Scott from Ngaita, who's done some really interesting research around how an MPA aligns with mātauranga and with Māori thinking. So thinking about rāhui, for example, and the similarities between rāhui and a marine protected area, where it doesn't stay on forever, it stays on for a while, and then we have to do a really good job of assessing what are the effects of that MPA and how has it changed things for the better or otherwise. And so Nigel Scott's done some really interesting work on this area, and also thinking about the methods that we use and how they stack up as well in terms of how Māori have interacted and the kinds of relationships that Māori have had with the environment and do have now. So yeah, just doing a plug for that, really.
Cool. Kia ora. So did you want to respond, Matt?
Certainly, having only a 35-year lifespan on this MPA is unusual, and it's difficult. It was one of the compromises that had to be put in place in order to get this through with all the other countries and their interests. But it certainly means that after 35 years, to make the case that this MPA needs to continue will be quite a difficult argument to make, and certainly if we don't have the science to back it up, it'll be near impossible. So kind of my aim is to try and set up some idea of what's necessary now, so that in 35 years time we will have the data in order to make a good case about why the MPA has been useful and whether it should continue or not, and whether it should be changed at all.
Yeah, cool, awesome. Thanks for that. And I wanted to bring us back to a point that I think you made quite early on, in referencing that the web, the interconnectedness of the whole thing. Just to reference back to our very first or our opening whakaaro, te whakairo, and the representation of Punga Werewere, the spider web, to try and represent that connectedness of it all. And you had a slide up where you had the web basically represented. But the other part of Te Whakairo, I think that Potes built in, was making sure that humans are represented as part of that web, and that if you break away any one of those scales, you set an imbalance. Do you think in that slide that you had put up, that the representation of humanity in that slide is reflective of that concept? Are we being included in the web that we're constructing and we're deconstructing the landscape down there with, especially when we know that these migratory species have connections to distant landscapes? So is the web that we're representing or thinking about the seascape with big enough, and are humans represented in that?
Yeah. Well, the first thing to say is that it's a food web, so it's not a. And I guess maybe this is a slight mismatch between Māori and food web approaches, in that Māori includes the spiritual and the values base. So you know, we might not eat whales, but there's a huge value of knowing that the whales are out there, you know, and having that connection with them out there. You know, we don't actually necessarily even need to interact with them, but just knowing that they're there on the planet is actually a huge spiritual and emotional and soul connection. So that isn't represented in a food web. Those kind of connections that just having that functioning world around us provides isn't included in those food webs. It's just looking at the flow of food. But people are kind of connected in that food web, in that kind of small part of it, by having fishing there. So historically, no one's eaten things from the Ross Sea. It's not a subsistence gathering kind of relationship. So that toothfish that's collected there, tends to end up in very high-priced restaurants in Europe and in the United States. So it's not a subsistence fishing. It's a way of generating high-value seafood, which goes into the economy. So in that sense, the appropriate place to put the human connection into that is not clear, but humans are included in there through the fishing. And so that's the sort of human role in that very restricted food web diagram.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a really cool whakaaro.
Actually, I'd just like to bring up this sort of gets into philosophy a bit. So Krishel Watene is our philosopher who'll be talking tomorrow. And I guess what I'm wondering now, Matt, is, and I'm sure Krishel will be able to answer this much more, much better than I can even think about it. But, if we as humans don't have direct connection or if we're not directly part of those food webs, can we apply kaitiakitanga, or if we're so many thousand kilometres distant from Antarctica, what are our responsibilities and how do we enact kaitiakitanga, or are those things appropriate in Antarctica? I'm just trying to sort of think about those connections, and anyway, I'm sure that Krishel tomorrow will have a much better way of articulating both the questions and the answers, or some thinking. So yeah,
I think we're onto something with this conversation, though. We've got a few more questions from Dan. So he says, marine protected areas are great, and he's actively advocating for more of them, but one of the drawbacks is that no one tells the organisms where the boundaries are. Cool whakaaro. Have you thought about wider forms of managing human activities?
Yeah, I mean, this is really at the heart of RAMP. I mean, most of the major organisms that the MPA is designed to protect move in and out of its boundaries. So the toothfish have a life cycle which takes them, they're in the MPA for a long time, then they move out of the MPA and become vulnerable to fishing. The whales move in and out of the area, the seals do, the penguins do. So the whole the traditional view of an MPA as protecting a sort of enclosed ecosystem doesn't work in the Ross Sea. And usually those kind of systems, those kind of large MPAs have a lot of those large mobile organisms in them. And so the question really is, what's the value of an MPA in that case? Because as I said, the catch limit on toothfish is the same since the MPA came up. What it's done is it's moved the location of the fishing around. So that can have certain benefits, like it can separate where those female Weddell seals are foraging when they're constrained to going back and feed their pups. Then there's no fishing localized. You don't get localized depletion of toothfish, but you can get large-scale depletion of toothfish if your fishing management is not proper. So certainly an MPA is not a silver bullet in that way. You've got to look at it alongside what the total catch limit is and all the other kinds of conservation measures which are brought in, such as managing bycatch and not damaging the benthos. So yeah, for sure, an MPA is only one part of that whole raft of management measures. It's not sufficient.
Hey Billy, I'm just going to see, we've got someone who might want to speak. So Rawiri, have you got a question that you'd like to ask? No, hang on. Unmute. Are you able to unmute?
We can only ask to unmute.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Might be a bit of a technical issue there.
Yeah. So we've got another question from Ursula, who I know is in a room full of people. So kia ora, Ursula and friends. A river in the North Island, maybe Wanganui River, was given rights. Do you think we could see these sorts of approaches or frameworks in the Southern Ocean, bringing Indigenous management into the Antarctic governance?
You know, I think that to recognise that the interconnectedness of a whole physical and ecological system as an entity in its own right, there's a plane going over here, is a great idea. You know, and it really recognises that interconnectedness of the ecosystem. In a practical sense, CAMLR is an extremely conservative organisation with a lot of members whose interest is very much around extracting as much fish as they possibly can from a system within the rules, or sometimes outside the rules. So to move all those countries into a direction where they can do this, I think in a practical sense is very unlikely. You know, we're already seeing a lot of pushback around protected areas from very pro-fishing countries, especially China and Russia, Japan also. And so we've kind of, through the CAMLR system and the opening of this fishery back from 1997, New Zealand has got a special responsibility for trying to manage these effects of fishing in the Ross Sea. But we also have limited power because the decision making around those management processes are all through by international consensus through CAMLR. So New Zealand's just got to, you know, it seems to me that our role is to provide the best science we can and to keep our standards and our values strong through CAMLR, and to try and win the argument that this is the rational way to fish in the Ross Sea and in the Southern Ocean. And we're going to do so in a way which minimises that risk of something bad happening to the system. So I think that question of how we can sort of do more innovative management around would be an excellent one to ask about our management of New Zealand resources around the EEZ and within our areas, where it's really just New Zealand that has to decide on how we do that. It's hard to do it, I think, in an international context, but you know, we could certainly do something like that domestically. As I said, if toothfish were in the New Zealand region, they would be exploited a lot harder with a lot fewer environmental and ecological controls than they are in the Southern Ocean. So there's no reason, it seems to me, that New Zealand couldn't learn from that and move to more of a broad definition of sustainability around New Zealand.
Cool. Kia ora. I see that Dan's jumped on, and did you want to have a kōrero, Dan?
Yeah, I just kept on finding myself typing away and thought I might just jump in.
Oh.
On that last point around the CAMLR being a largely conservative group, I agree completely with you. But remember that our national government is also pretty much a largely conservative group overall, yet it was them who co-created the Te Urewera Act, which is the first one in New Zealand to give land, river, forest, legal personality, and then they co-created the Te Awa Tupua Act, which is the one that gave the Wanganui River legal personality. And I suppose I agree, we have to act locally, but then we can use that to influence internationally. You know, we've already got in Bolivia and Ecuador, you know, the plurinatural rights of Pachamama, of Earth Mother, exists there. There is a widespread movement around the Pacific for actually giving the ocean its own voice, for giving the ocean its own rights. I would encourage any of you who are on CAMLR to float these ideas, because you have to start sowing seeds somewhere before you get the beautiful forest that's going to grow in a few years' time. Without those seeds, without the ground being, you know, tilled and prepared, and they'll never take. So I encourage you to propose those ideas in those places.
What do you think the prospect is for doing something like that in the EEZ? You know, the Chatham Rise is a beautiful ecosystem and a highly productive one. You know, and the Hauraki Gulf, you know, Golden Tasman Bays. You know, there's a lot of very highly impacted areas around New Zealand that you know, that kind of approach would be, you know, really interesting to look at.
Yeah, and so when I go back to my earlier comment that I'm really interested in marine protected areas, or marine management, as it were, you know, we've got the Marine Spatial Plan for the Hauraki Gulf. We've got a Ministerial Advisory Committee who who their report is imminent, reporting on the 181 recommendations. A cautionary tale, though, that taking the legal personality and applying it everywhere isn't our silver bullet. Just like marine protected areas aren't our silver bullet. It worked in the Tuiri Wera for a few reasons. Basically it's just tūhoi. It worked for the Wanganui because they all whakapapa to the same ancestor there, effectively the river itself. The next challenge was trying to get a few different iwi and hapu, and I think the Taranaki maunga will be the next one, and that challenge was overcome. But I agree, but certainly those ideas and of giving that its own voice, I like that idea as well. So instead of maybe not legal personality with rights, shift it from rights and shift it to voice. If we actually gave this thing a voice and then put some teeth around it, what could that look like? I agree, the Chatham Rise, and I need to be careful here because I'm involved with Environmental Protection Authority procedures, but my personal opinion is places like the Chatham Rise deserve to be protected.
What do you think though, Dan? I mean, is this just another, we're using Pākehā tools, we're not really using Māori thinking. I'm just throwing down the gauntlet here for, but does it really encapsulate Māori philosophical thinking or mātauranga? I mean, it just sounds as though it's using the tools of the Pākehā again.
Well, it's both, and I'll hesitate from quoting directly from my articles that talk about this, but the idea we give is the idea that you give something its own personality is entirely from an Indigenous worldview. It's entirely from Mātauranga Māori. You could go back to Blackstone, who kind of argues some similar ideas around water, but nevertheless, that idea of giving something, recognising something as an ancestor, is very strongly from a Māori worldview, but it's still pinned within a Westminster system of law, and it's within a system. And we argue that actually, by giving it kind of a legal personality as a human, we're actually diminishing its mana because it's a tupuna, te awa tupua, which is even greater than people themselves. So this is very much a crucial type discussion.
Aye.
But I think if I had to say, is it better than what we had before? Absolutely. Is it the final step, do we think? No, maybe not.
Aye.
So Matt, just to go back to the marine protected area, if you were thinking what would be the best possible way of protecting the marine protected area in your view? I mean, how in an ideal world, how would you see it?
I think to some extent, the total amount of reduction of the abundance of a target species is the single best indicator of the effect that's going to have on the rest of the system. So, in an ideal world, I would move that 50% depletion target to a depletion of 25% and leave 75% in the ocean. I think that would be, if they did that, I'd be pretty happy that the system was going to tick along okay for the foreseeable future, notwithstanding the effects of climate change. I think 50% is risky. Taking half the spawning stock out is a big change. So,
hey, Billy, there's just an awesome comment in the chat, in the Q&A as well.
Yeah,
about
I wanted to bring that up from Alan Hemmings. Kia ora, Alan. So in terms of this conversation, there may be mechanisms in relation to spatially separated ecosystems, though the obligations in relation to the concept of dependent and associated ecosystems under the Madrid Protocol. And he says we just need to find a way to apply this in relation to CHEMLA. But for example, given we have orca traversing the Ross Sea to New Zealand, we plainly need to do so. So those ideas of connectedness that are far broader than what fit within these boundaries of a protected area, I think is sort of playing out there. But I also just wanted to, because we're running out of time, sorry everybody, I know this is an awesome kōrero. Dan, I'd love to pick up on your point there, is that we've set an awesome sort of foregrounding for Krishal's talk, whose is coming up next tomorrow at 1 p.m. So she's our philosopher and she keeps us grounded. I don't know if she keeps us grounded or keeps us lofty. in any case, I think this conversation sets it up perfectly for Krishel to jump in and tell us all what we should be thinking. So I might just wrap it up there, if that's cool with everybody. Scylla, did you want to have any final words?
I'm sure Krishel won't tell us what to think. She'll be just asking hundreds of questions so we can all go away and think. But that's great, because actually the whole purpose of the seminar series, the whole purpose of the seminar series is so that we do have lots of questions and we can go and kōrero with the whānau, with the hapu, with the iwi, because I think it's really important that we do all start thinking about these questions and about how do we want to engage with Antarctica, and what does that look like, and what do we really, what do we see, what's our vision for the future in relation to Māori and Antarctica. So yeah, I'm expecting more questions tomorrow than answers. Yeah,
true. You're right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that, kōrero. Thank you, Matt, for your presentation. It's amazing, and I think you've really got everybody thinking, and that's exactly what we're trying to do. Dan, thank you for jumping in there and for your questions. Incredibly insightful, and taking it into making that bridge into Krishel's kōrero tomorrow. So I might just finish up there and have a karakia to wrap us up, and then we'll see everybody tomorrow at 1 p.m. for Krishel Watene from Massey University. Oh, Matt's ditched us already. Unihia ke te uru tapanui, kia wātea, kia mama, te ngākau, te tinana, te wairawa I te ara takatā, ko ia rā e rongo, whakairia ake ki runga. Kia tina, hui e, tae ki e. Kia ora tātou.
Matt's still here, Billy. He just turned off his video.
Don't want to distract from you.
Kia ora,